So we are sitting here in August 2026, and if you just look at the official economic dashboard for the United States, you would really think we're in the middle of this like absolute golden age.
Oh, yeah. The warning lights are all green.
Right, the engine is humming smoothly. I mean, we just got the latest numbers from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they are reporting that real gross domestic product, real GDP, grew at an annualized rate of 1.5% in the second quarter of this year.
And that is coming right on the heels of a really robust 2.1% growth rate in the first quarter.
So it's a trend. Personal income is officially up. Consumer spending is officially up. By every traditional macroeconomic metric, the American economy is doing exactly what you want an economy to do. It is expanding.
It's doing great on paper.
On paper. But the mission of is to ask a very direct question. And it's a question I really want you, the listener, to ask yourself right now as you're tuning in. Does your bank account actually feel like it is growing?
I think if we were to poll the people listening right now, the overwhelming response to that question would be a resounding, almost angry no.
Yeah, angry is a good word for it.
It really is. The gap between those macroeconomic headlines and the microeconomic reality happening at, the kitchen table is arguably the defining financial story of this entire decade. We're looking at a massive, glaring disconnect.
A total clash of realities.
Exactly. And to understand it, we can't just rely on one data point. So we are pulling together a whole stack of incredibly revealing sources today.
We've got the Bureau of Economic Analysis dashboards, obviously, but we're also looking at the Federal Reserve's internal household well-being surveys and some brand new, highly detailed tariff modeling from the Yale Budget Lab.
Right, because our goal here is to figure out why the data says we are rich, but the consumer feels like they are literally just hanging on by a thread.
The clash in the data sets we brought today is just wild to me. I mean, we have this supposedly growing economy, right? But then you look at consumer sentiment.
Oh, the sentiment numbers are brutal.
Brutal. In July 2026, consumer sentiment was sitting at just 54.4. Now, for some context here, that is a slight improvement from June, but it is way down from the 61.7 we saw a year earlier.
And a score of 54.4 is fundamentally deeply pessimistic.
Right. It's the kind of number you expect to see during a severe recession, not during a period of GDP expansion. So I just have to challenge this premise right out of the gate. Are the headline numbers just fundamentally flawed? Is the BEA using bad methodology?
Let's look to wonder that.
Or are we as consumers just needlessly pessimistic? Is this a case of lifestyle creep where we are all walking around holding $1,000 smartphones, drinking $6 coffees, and complaining that we feel poor while sitting in the middle of an economic boom?
Well, neither of those assumptions paints the full picture, even though, both are incredibly common arguments you hear all the time.
Right.
The headline numbers from the BEA are mathematically accurate, according to their established formulas. I mean, they aren't cooking the books.
Okay, so the data is real.
The data is real. But the consumer pessimism is also entirely justified. And this is the uncomfortable truth that most traditional economists really struggle to communicate. Both of these realities exist simultaneously.
Wait, how does that work?
Well, you can have a structurally growing national economy and a deeply stressed, highly pessimistic consumer base at the exact same time.
Because the national economy is an aggregate.
Exactly. It totals everything up into one big pile. But individuals do not live in the aggregate.
So how do we actually measure the individual experience then? Because clearly GDP is missing something massive here.
To measure the individual experience, we have to turn to how the Federal Reserve tracks household well-being. They conduct this massive, comprehensive survey of consumer finances.
And the most recent results are like a perfect mirror of this paradox we're talking about.
They really are, because they ask people point blank how they're doing. And on one hand, 73% of Americans told the Fed they are doing okay financially or even living comfortably.
Okay, I have to jump in here because I have the counter statistics from that exact same Fed report right in front of me, and the contradiction is just stunning.
It's quite the whiplash.
Yeah. In the very same breath where 73% say they are doing okay, 53% say rising prices are a major financial concern.
Right.
And even more telling, 58% say that changes in the prices they are paying have actively made their financial situation worse over the last year. So how do you reconcile a population where almost 3/4 say they are financially okay, but nearly 60% say they are being actively squeezed and degraded by the cost of living? I mean, those two statements feel mutually exclusive.
You reconcile it by recognizing what everyday people actually experience versus what they define as being quote-unquote okay.
What do you mean?
Well, when someone says they're doing okay, they often just mean they haven't been evicted, their lights are still on, and they have food in the fridge. They are surviving. But survival is not the same as financial prosperity. Let's really think about how a human being actually interacts with the economy. You don't experience gross domestic product when you wake up in the morning.
Right, I'm not checking the GDP before I brush my teeth.
Exactly. When you pour your coffee, you do not feel a 1.5% increase in aggregate national output flowing into your mug. What you experience is the price of the coffee beans.
The actual physical cost?
Yes. You experience the cost of the groceries, the rent check, the mortgage deduction, the car payment, the insurance premium, and the electricity bill.
You basically experience the gap between your paycheck and your outgoing obligations.
And that is the defining metric of human economic life. The macroeconomic numbers like GDP and overall consumer spending, they measure the sheer size of the national pie.
So if a billionaire buys like a $500 million yacht, consumer spending goes up, GDP goes up.
Right, and it looks like the economy is booming. But the consumer sentiment numbers, those measure the math of everyday survival. They measure the friction of just existing in the world.
Wow, so it sounds like we have to completely stop looking at the economy from like 30,000 feet. Looking at the aggregate is basically useless if we want to understand the modern American consumer right now.
Mostly useless.
You have to bring our analysis all the way down to the checking account level.
We absolutely have to stop treating the economy like a single, unified organism. A nation is not a household.
Right.
The economy is actually millions of separate individual balance sheets.
Yeah.
And right now, the math on those individual balance sheets is telling a story of intense pressure that the national GDP numbers completely obscure.
Let's get into the mechanics of that pressure, then. I want to talk about inflation, because I feel like this is the specific battleground where the media narrative and the kitchen table reality completely detach from each other.
Without a doubt.
Because if you turn on any financial news network right now, you hear a constant drumbeat that inflation is cooling off, the rates are coming down, central bankers are taking victory laps.
Everyone's cheering.
Right. So why does everything still feel so incredibly painfully expensive to the average consumer? I mean, if inflation is supposedly beaten, shouldn't we be feeling some relief at the cash register?
To understand why there is no relief, we really have to unpack one of the most fundamental and, frankly, most dangerous misunderstandings in modern economic communication.
Which is?
The critical difference between disinflation and deflation. These two words sound similar, but they describe entirely different economic universes.
Okay, walk me through the difference.
Disinflation means slower inflation. It means prices are still going up, just at a less aggressive pace than they were before.
Okay.
Deflation means falling prices. So when the media and policymakers cheer that inflation is cooling, they are cheering for disinflation. They are just celebrating the fact that the speed at which you are losing your purchasing power has slowed down.
But consumers hear the phrase, inflation is cooling, and they expect deflation. They expect the prices to actually drop back down to where they were in like 2019 or 2020.
They do. And it sets up this massive psychological betrayal. When the government says, hey, we fixed inflation, the consumer goes to the store expecting the old prices.
And when they don't see them,
They assume the government is lying, or the corporations are price gouging, or the data is just totally fake.
I want to move away from abstract percentages and ground this in something visceral. I was reading a piece analyzing the compounding nature of price hikes, and it made me think of the grocery bill. Because percentages kind of lie to our brains, you know?
Yeah, human brains don't process compounding math very well at all.
Right. So let's run the math on a weekly grocery bill, because food is like the ultimate unavoidable cost.
Let's do it.
Imagine a hypothetical weekly grocery bill for a family of 4. A few years ago, you were spending, let's say, $150 a week to feed your family. You had your routine, you knew exactly what you could afford.
Standard budget.
Then the massive inflationary spike hits. The supply chains break, labor costs rise, fertilizer gets expensive. That $150 weekly bill creeps up to $165.
And you feel the pinch.
A few months later, it hits $175. Eventually, it settles at $185. During that whole traumatic period, inflation was running hot, maybe 8 or 9% year over year.
Right.
Now, fast forward to today, August 2026. The central bank has raised interest rates, demand has cooled slightly, and the official inflation rate drops from that terrifying 8% down to a much more manageable 3%. The media reports this as a massive victory.
The inflation dragon has been slain.
Exactly. But look at your grocery bill. The bill doesn't go back down to $150.
It never goes back down to $150. It stays at $185. The new baseline has been established. And worse, because inflation is still running at 3%, which again is disinflation, a slower rate of growth.
That $185 bill is actually going to grow to $190 and then $195.
Exactly. Slower inflation does not mean falling prices. It just means the bleeding isn't happening as fast. But the permanent damage to your purchasing power, that $35 weekly gap, has already been done. The new floor is $185.
I've always hated the speeding car analogy that economists use for this.
Oh, where they say, if you're driving 90 miles an hour and slow down to 30, you're still moving forward.
Yeah, it's too passive. A better way to look at disinflation is like a compounding debt. If you owe a loan shark money and the interest rate drops from 20% a week to 5% a week, you aren't suddenly richer.
No, you still owe a ton of money.
Your total debt is still massive, and it is still growing, just slightly less violently. The burden you carry on your back hasn't gotten any lighter. They just stopped adding rocks quite as quickly.
That is a much more accurate mechanical metaphor because it captures the cumulative burden. And I want to get into the specific mechanics of why those prices don't come down. Because it is not just arbitrary corporate greed.
Okay, let's trace it.
Think about the supply chain of that grocery bill. For a box of cereal to reach your table, a farmer had to buy diesel fuel for the tractor, which was more expensive. They had to buy fertilizer, which spiked in price. The grain was processed in a facility paying higher electricity rates. It was driven to a warehouse by a trucker who successfully negotiated a 15% wage increase because of the labor shortage.
Yeah, that trucker isn't giving that raise back.
Exactly. Then it was stocked on a shelves by a retail worker who's now making $18 an hour instead of $12. All of those input costs are sticky.
Meaning they don't reverse.
Right. You cannot easily cut the trucker's wage back down. You cannot unburn the expensive diesel fuel. Those costs are now baked into the absolute molecular structure of the cereal box.
Which means the $185 grocery bill is permanent. And I really want to pull up the June 2026 Bureau of Labor Statistics data to prove just how heavy this compounding debt feels right now.
Okay, what do the numbers say?
So the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, showed that overall consumer prices were 3.5% higher than a year earlier. Food prices specifically were up 3.0%.
Which is the disinflation the media is talking about. Sounds manageable.
It sounds totally fine. But then you look under the hood at the unavoidable costs, the painful outliers that actually dictate daily life. Energy prices were up 15.7% year over year in June 2026.
Wow.
And gasoline prices up a staggering 26.7% over the exact same period.
See, when essential, unavoidable costs spike like that, it obliterates the entire concept of a national average. When we talk about core inflation on the macroeconomic level, economists routinely strip out food and energy prices.
Which always felt crazy to me.
Well, they do it because food and energy are highly volatile commodities, They bounce around based on weather, geopolitical conflicts, refining capacity. Stripping them out gives a smoother curve for monetary policy decisions.
But you cannot strip food and energy out of a human being's life.
Right.
A human being is not a monetary policy model. You have to eat calories and you have to combust energy to get to your job.
Exactly. When gasoline is up 26.7%, that is not a discretionary expense you can simply elect to skip. It is a mandatory tax on your daily existence. It disproportionately drags down a household's available capital, regardless of what the core inflation percentage says. Think about the mechanics of the household ledger. If it costs you $20 more to fill up your gas tank every single week, that is $80 a month that is forcibly extracted from your budget.
And that $80 just vanishes completely. It cannot be saved in an emergency fund. It cannot be invested in a retirement account. It cannot be spent on a dinner out to support a local business.
No, it's just gone.
It is fed into the internal combustion engine just to maintain the exact same baseline of life you had last year. You are essentially spending more money to stand perfectly still.
The economic mechanism at play here is called forced reallocation. When a fixed, unavoidable cost, like gasoline or home heating oil, goes up by double digits, it forcefully reallocates capital within the household budget.
Because you have no choice.
Right. Even if the overall inflation rate is a manageable 3.5%, your lived experience is dictated entirely by the pain points. If your electricity bill jumps 15% and your gas jumps 26%, your brain does not average those out with the fact that apparel or used cars might be slightly cheaper this month.
Yeah, you don't look at your gas receipt and say, well, my commute costs a fortune, but at least this t-shirt was $2 less.
Right. Your brain fixates on the drain of available cash.
Which naturally brings us to why this is happening psychologically, because people don't just sit at the kitchen table and calculate the CPI formula. They do the math in their heads instinctively every single time they swipe a credit card.
And a huge part of this feeling of being poorer, of feeling squeezed despite a growing GDP, comes down to a concept called price memory.
We have to dive into this because it explains so much of the anger we see in the consumer sentiment data. Why are consumers so absolutely fixated on what things used to cost?
Price memory is rooted really deeply in behavioral economics and neuroeconomics. Humans are incredibly associative creatures, and we use historical data to build our expectations of reality.
Makes sense.
We rely on a psychological phenomenon known as angering bias. Consumers use old prices as a permanent, rigid mental reference point.
Okay, give me a practical example.
Let's look at a local diner, maybe your favorite spot. For years, you went there, and a standard dinner for two cost $35. Over a decade, your brain categorized $35 as the correct and fair price for that specific caloric and social experience.
Right, that's just what it costs.
Then, a massive inflationary cycle hits. The diner has to pay more for beef, more for cooking oil, more for their wait staff. They raise prices just to survive, and now that exact same meal costs $50.
Okay, but even if your wages have gone up, even if you can theoretically afford the $50 without going into debt, your brain flags that $15 difference as like a persistent recurring loss.
Yes, it registers as a penalty. Loss aversion is an incredibly powerful cognitive force. Studies consistently show that the psychological pain of losing $15 is about twice as intense as the joy of finding $15.
Wow.
So when you sit down at that diner, it feels like a violation of the established social contract. The old price is the anchor, and the new price creates intense cognitive friction.
It feels like you were being actively robbed. I mean, even if you intellectually understand the mechanics of supply chain costs, labor shortages, and commodity pricing, your emotional brain rejects it. You look at the menu and you just feel resentment.
And it's not just restaurants. It is everywhere.
Right. People remember when a decent used car was $10,000. They remember the cheaper car insurance they had 3 years ago. The brain just outright refuses to accept the new baseline.
And traditional macroeconomists often dismiss this price memory as irrational sentiment. They look at the spreadsheets and say, the consumer's being illogical, their nominal income supports this new price level.
But is it irrational?
Psychologically, it is profound and highly rational from an evolutionary perspective. The brain is trying to protect its resources. It registers inflation not as a neutral macroeconomic shift in the money supply, but as a direct threat to survival.
Every single transaction becomes a micro-stressor.
Exactly. It's a reminder that your labor does not go as far as it used to.
Okay, let me push back on this because I can hear a traditional macroeconomist yelling at their phone right now listening to us. What about the other side of the ledger? What about wages?
Nominal wage growth.
Yeah, we have seen significant nominal wage growth over the last few years. If we look at the data, wages for the lowest quartile of earners actually outpaced inflation for a while. So let's use a hypothetical scenario to test this.
Right.
Let's say you are an average worker and your income actually rises by 4% this year. That is a solid raise.
Definitely.
If overall inflation is sitting at 3.5% and your income rises by 4%, shouldn't you theoretically feel richer? The math says you are coming out ahead by 0.5%. Why doesn't the consumer feel that victory?
Because that logic relies on a fundamental misunderstanding of how household cash flow actually works. The macro math says you are ahead, sure, but the micro math, the actual household ledger, tells a very different, much darker story.
Break that down for me.
Let's look closely at the mechanics of income versus expenses. Let's assume you get that 4% raise. Congratulations.
Wait.
But remember that 4% is applied to your gross top-line income.
Right.
It is immediately subject to federal, state, and payroll taxes before you ever see a dime of it. A 4% gross raise might only translate to a 2.5 or 3% increase in your actual net take-home pay.
So right off the bat, the tax wedge eats a chunk of the victory.
Exactly. Now let's look at your outgoing cash flow, your actual expenses. Suppose your rent goes up 6%, which is highly common as housing supply remains constrained.
Very common.
Suppose your car and home insurance jumps 10%. which is actually pretty conservative given the massive insurance rate hikes we've seen across the country due to climate risks and higher vehicle repair costs.
Yeah, insurance is out of control right now.
Then your electricity rises 4%. The cost of your weekly groceries is compounded. If your net income went up 3%, but your unavoidable baseline costs went up 6, 8, or 10%, your financial breathing room is completely destroyed.
So the increase in income is getting immediately cannibalized by the disproportional increase in essential expenses.
Gross income increased, yes.
Oh.
You might be making more nominal dollars than you ever have in your entire life. But your discretionary cash flow, the actual money you have left over at the end of the month to save, invest, or spend on leisure, actually shrinks.
Wow.
You are mathematically closer to insolvency while earning your highest salary ever.
And this brings up a massive structural issue that we really need to dig into, the concept of fixed commitments. We have a tendency, especially in media and political rhetoric, to think of a paycheck as a pile of money that a person gets to, like, consciously decide how to spend.
Right, like they're starting from scratch every month.
Yeah, we imagine the consumer sitting at a desk on the first of the month, allocating funds. But in reality, a modern paycheck is mostly spoken for before it even hits the bank account.
The modern American household doesn't just spend money, it commits future income. Before that direct deposit even clears the banking system, there are immense structural claims on it.
Right.
The mortgage or rent takes a massive, unavoidable slice. The car loan takes another. The student loan takes a piece. The health insurance premium, the utility bills, the phone contracts, the minimum payments on credit cards, these are all fixed commitments.
Contractual obligations.
Exactly. They're contractual obligations that you cannot easily modify in the short term.
It is like having a large bucket that already has 10 holes drilled in the bottom before you even turn on the hose. And those holes are fixed in size. Or, in the case of inflation, the holes are actually getting wider.
Yeah, that's a good way to picture it.
By the time the water, your paycheck, actually settles in the bucket, it is draining out so fast there is very little left to scoop out for discretionary use.
Let's upgrade that metaphor to structural engineering, because it captures the real danger much better. Think of a household budget like a bridge built to handle a specific load capacity.
Okay.
Fixed commitments are the dead load, the permanent weight of the concrete and steel that the bridge must support just to stand up. Discretionary income is the live load, the traffic moving across it.
Got it.
If you build a bridge where the dead load takes up 95% of the structural capacity, it doesn't take much traffic to cause a catastrophic collapse.
To really drive this engineering metaphor home, I want to walk through a hypothetical comparison that perfectly illustrates this. It completely shatters the idea that a high income equals financial security. Let's look at the financial architecture of two different families.
Okay, let's look at the balance sheets.
We'll call them Family A and Family B. They both make the exact same salary, $100,000 a year. On paper, to the IRS, to the GDP statisticians tracking national income, these families are absolutely identical. They contribute the exact same amount to the national aggregate. But let's look at their structural setup, their fixed commitments.
This is where we separate top-line revenue from the actual health of the balance sheet. Let's look at Family A first. They bought a house years ago and locked in a very low 3% fixed-rate mortgage.
So their housing cost is heavily stabilized.
Very stabilized. They do not carry any revolving credit card debt. They buy used cars in cash, so they have no auto loans dragging on their monthly cash flow. Because their fixed commitments, their structural dead load are low, they are able to maintain a high savings rate. They have a deep buffer.
Now let's look at Family B. They earn the exact same $100,000, but they entered the housing market later, so they are renting an expensive apartment that hikes the rent by 5 to 7% every single year.
Which is brutally common.
They have 2 cars financed on 72-month loans with heavy monthly payments. They have lingering student loans that require hundreds of dollars a month. And because of these massive fixed commitments, they have virtually zero cash reserves.
Their salaries are identical, but their economic realities belong to two different universes. And this is the core insight of why inflation feels so destructive.
Because it hits them differently.
Exactly. When prices rise, when inflation hits the grocery store, or gas jumps 26%, the impact is not distributed evenly. Family A is annoyed. They might complain about the price of steak at a barbecue, but their lifestyle does not materially change.
They just save slightly less that month.
Right. The structural integrity of their bridge holds.
But Family B?
Family B is structurally compromised because almost 100% of their income is already allocated to fixed commitments. An unexpected spike in gas prices or a 15% jump in their electricity bill literally breaks their budget.
The bridge collapses.
The bridge collapses. They do not have the margin to absorb the shock. They are forced to either default on a commitment, cut calories, or take on high-interest debt to bridge the gap.
Are we sure we can't blame Family B a little bit here? I mean, a lot of people listening might say, well, Family B shouldn't have financed too expensive cars. They made bad choices. Isn't some of this just lifestyle creep masquerading as inflation pain?
That is a fair pushback, and consumer choices absolutely matter. But we have to look at the macroeconomic environment Family B is operating in.
What do you mean?
Well, the used car market went through a historic supply shock. Cheap, reliable cash cars practically disappeared for several years.
True, they were so hard to find.
And the housing market saw a massive structural deficit in available starter homes, forcing people into expensive rentals. Yes, individuals make choices, but they made choices within a constrained architecture. For millions of younger households, the Family A setup wasn't just a choice, it was an economic environment that literally no longer exists.
Which immediately makes me ask about the fragility of this system. What happens when these heavily committed households, the ones operating at 99% structural capacity, hit a bump in the road?
It's rarely pretty.
Because life is not a clean spreadsheet. Things break. Cars blow transmissions, roofs leak, kids get sick and need a prescription that insurance suddenly refuses to cover. What are the consequences of living with zero financial margin?
The consequence of zero margin is that inconveniences become absolute catastrophes. And this is precisely where the macroeconomic data completely fails to capture human suffering.
Because it just averages it out.
Right. The BEA can report 1.5% GDP growth all day long, but it cannot measure the terror of a broken water heater when you have $0 in your checking account.
I want to pull a statistic here from the 2025 Federal Reserve data that honestly terrified me. The Fed found that only 63% of adults could cover a hypothetical $400 emergency using cash or its equivalent.
It's a famous stat, and it's grim.
Now, on one hand, 63% is a majority. But I have a massive problem with how we even frame this survey question. Who only has a $400 emergency these days?
Almost no one.
When was the last time you took a modern vehicle loaded with sensors and computers to a mechanic and they only charged you $400? What happens when the AC compressor breaks in August or the car needs a $1,500 repair just to pass inspection so you can get to work?
You are identifying the exact flaw in the $400 metric. It is an artifact of a bygone pricing era. But let's look at the terrifying implications of the 37% of adults who could not even cover that outdated $400 benchmark with cash.
That is well over a third of the country.
Yes. If they get a $1,500 repair bill for their transmission, they cannot just write a check. They cannot pull it from a savings account. So what is the mechanical reality of their situation? They put it on a credit card.
And right now, credit card interest rates are hovering well over 20%. Some retail cards are hitting 28 or 29%.
Exactly. So that $1,500 repair does not cost $1,500. Because they cannot pay the balance in full, the debt begins to compound. It adds a brand new fixed monthly commitment, the minimum payment, to a budget that was already stretched to the breaking point.
So a mechanical failure turns into structural debt.
The lack of margin turns a one-time mechanical failure into a multi-year compounding debt cycle.
Let's break down the math on that cascade effect.
For a household with $50,000 in liquid savings, a $1,500 repair is just an annoying Tuesday. The money leaves the account, and the balance sheet barely registers a dent. But for a household living paycheck to paycheck, that $1,500 repair pushes them over the edge of insolvency.
They just fall off the cliff.
Suddenly, they are exposed to the harshest, most punitive mechanisms of the financial system: late fees, compounding interest, penalty APRs.
It fundamentally changes a person's exposure to the economy. If you have $20,000 in liquid savings, a $50 monthly expense increase, say your internet provider hikes your rate, is practically invisible.
You might not even notice it hitting your autopay.
Right. You are insulated. But if you have exactly $40 left over at the end of the month, after all your fixed commitments are paid, a $50 increase is not a math problem you can solve. It is a catastrophe.
It really is.
It means you literally cannot clear the month. You have to actively choose to default on something, or skip a meal, or float a utility bill.
And we know this is a widespread systemic reality, not just an isolated phenomenon. The Fed's survey also found that the share of adults who say they always or often have money left over at the end of the month remains essentially unchanged from the previous year.
So no improvement.
No improvement. Despite the GDP growth, despite the nominal wage increases across the labor market, the actual breathing room is completely stagnant. The margin is not improving.
Which perfectly explains this macro versus micro divide we've been circling. The national average is hiding the individual struggle. You can absolutely have a growing gross domestic product because the top 20% of earners, the people with massive asset portfolios, low fixed commitments, and high cash flow, are spending aggressively on travel, dining, and luxury goods.
And their spending alone can pull the aggregate numbers up.
While the bottom 50% are literally drowning in 20+% credit card debt just to buy groceries.
Averages distort our understanding of reality by smoothing out the extremes. You have a barbell economy. You are blending the extreme financial security of Family A with the structural insolvency of Family B, and the BEA algorithm declares that, on average, the American consumer is healthy.
But an average does not pay a specific electric bill.
No, it does not.
Let me take on the role of the macroeconomist again, pointing to the positive trends, because I hear this argument all the time on financial television.
Oh, I'm sure you do. Let's hear it.
The anchors sit there and say, look, things are great. Look at manufactured goods. A 65-inch flat-screen TV is actually 10% cheaper now than it was 2 years ago. The stock market is near all-time highs. How can people possibly claim the economy is bad when their 401k is up 15% and electronics are cheaper than ever?
That argument relies on intentionally confusing headline data with essential costs, and it ignores a fundamental economic concept called Baumol's cost disease.
Okay, tell me about Baumol's cost disease.
Well, it is absolute true that televisions are cheaper. It is true that certain manufactured goods, plastic toys, and consumer electronics have seen price drops due to hyper-efficient global supply chains and automated manufacturing.
But how often does a human being buy a television? Maybe once every 5 or 7 years.
Precisely the point. Consumers do not build their lives around the average price of a theoretical basket of manufactured goods.
Yeah.
They build their lives around unavoidable costs. A cheaper flat-screen TV does not pay the rent.
You cannot eat a television.
You cannot drive a television to work. The 5 pillars of essential, unavoidable costs in the modern American economy are housing, transportation, food, healthcare, and insurance.
And none of those are getting cheaper.
Because these are largely service-based or highly localized markets that do not benefit from the same globalization deflation that makes TVs cheap. If the prices of those 5 pillars are rising aggressively, it absolutely does not matter if apparel and electronics are cheaper.
The psychological weight of price increases is not evenly distributed across categories. If I buy a t-shirt once a year and it's $2 cheaper, it barely registers.
Okay.
But a permanent structural increase in something I pay for every single week, like my groceries or my gasoline, completely dominates my perception of my financial reality.
Because it dominates your cash flow. And this brings up the exhausting political messaging around all of this. Every single election cycle, we see politicians yelling at each other about the economy.
It's endless.
One side screams about GDP growth, job creation, and a booming stock market. The other side yells about crushing prices, credit card debt, and the cost of living. And as a voter, you sit there wondering who is actually right? Who is manipulating the data?
Who is telling the truth?
Impartially speaking, looking purely at the data, they're both telling the truth.
Wait, really? Both?
Yes. They're just pointing to entirely different measurements of the exact same economy. An economy of 330 million people is far too complex to be captured by one narrative.
True.
A country can have low unemployment, but incredibly high job insecurity, where people have jobs but are terrified of being replaced by automation or outsourced. A country can have a roaring stock market that sets record highs, but millions of citizens who have zero investments, no equity, and feel absolutely none of that wealth effect.
So they just pick the stat that works for them.
The politicians cherry-pick the metric that supports their narrative, but ordinary Americans are just left staring at their bank account balance trying to make the math work.
And speaking of making the math work, we have to explore the immense difference between wealth and cash flow, because this is another massive blind spot in the data. Let's use a tangible example to explain this.
Okay.
Imagine someone who bought a house 10 or 15 years ago in a decent suburb. Because of the massive run-up in real estate values, that house is now worth $700,000 on paper. If you look at this person's net worth, they look incredibly wealthy. The macro data says they are a massive winner in this economy.
On paper, their net worth is highly elevated, yes. But let's look at the mechanics of their daily life. Can they slice off a piece of the roof to buy groceries?
Obviously not.
No. That wealth is illiquid. In fact, that $700,000 homeowner might actually feel completely broke on a Tuesday morning.
Why? Because as the assessed value of the house skyrocketed, so did the property taxes. So did the cost of their homeowner's insurance, which in some states has doubled or tripled. So did the cost of maintenance. I mean, when you call a plumber or an electrician now, their labor rates are vastly higher. If those property taxes, insurance premiums, and maintenance costs consume their entire monthly cash flow, that $700,000 asset is essentially trapping them.
They are experiencing the phenomenon of being house rich but cash poor. It is phantom wealth. It exists on a spreadsheet, but it does not improve their daily standard of living.
You can't spend it.
You cannot spend it unless you sell the house or borrow against it at very high current interest rates. But if you sell the house, where do you go? You have to go buy another incredibly expensive house or rent at inflated rates.
Let's contrast that $700,000 homeowner with a renter. Let's say we have a renter who has a much lower net worth because they don't own appreciating real property. But their rent is highly manageable, they have zero debt of any kind, and they have $40,000 in liquid cash savings sitting in a high-yield account.
A very different structural setup.
Right. The macroeconomic data says the homeowner is vastly more successful. But the lived experience, the actual financial freedom, the ability to sleep peacefully at night without anxiety is vastly superior for the renter with high cash flow and high liquidity.
Cash flow dictates your mood. Net worth is just a number on a balance sheet. The anxiety people feel isn't just about what is happening today, it's the fear of what is coming tomorrow.
Which shifts us to the bigger picture of where this is all heading. If the economy is growing right now, if unemployment is generally stable, why are people behaving so defensively? Why is everyone acting like there is a monster hiding in the closet?
Because humans are fundamentally forward-looking creatures. Economic behavior is not just driven by the current reality, it is driven heavily by the economic weight of expectations.
Expectations of what?
Well, expectations act as a gravitational pull on current behavior. If you expect prices to rise in the future, it completely alters your behavior in the present. You might hoard non-perishable items. You might delay a major purchase, like a car or a home renovation, because you are afraid of taking on more debt.
You hunker down.
Right. You might demand a raise from your boss to front-run the inflation you see coming. Or you might aggressively hoard cash out of sheer fear of the unknown.
And the data absolutely supports this pervasive fear. The sources we are looking at note that in June 2026, the New York Fed survey showed that median one-year inflation expectations are sitting at 3.7%.
Which is high.
That is the highest level recorded in that survey since September 2023. So, despite the disinflationary trends of the past year, people are actively anticipating that things are going to get significantly more expensive over the next 12 months. They do not believe the inflation dragon has been slain.
And when expectations of inflation remain that high, it risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Oh, so?
This is the nightmare scenario for central bankers. If businesses expect their input costs to rise by 3.7% next year, they will proactively raise their prices by 4% today to protect their future margins.
Oh, wow.
If workers expect their cost of living to jump, they demand higher wages today, which forces businesses to raise prices further to cover the payroll. This is the wage price spiral.
So the fear of inflation causes the inflation.
The psychological expectation actually generates the exact inflation they are afraid of. Economics collides deeply with psychology here. People aren't perfect calculators. They're constantly comparing the present with the past and projecting their anxieties into the future.
And there is a massive source of looming uncertainty on the horizon that is heavily feeding this anxiety right now, which is trade policy, specifically the intense conversation around tariffs.
A huge topic right now.
Now, I want to establish a very clear boundary for our listeners right now. We are looking at this purely as economic analysts. We are not taking a partisan stance on whether tariffs are good policy for protecting domestic manufacturing or bad policy for global trade relations.
Right.
We're strictly focusing on the mathematical mechanics and the immediate consumer impact based on the data provided in our Yale source.
That is a crucial distinction. We are analyzing the mechanics of the supply chain, not the politics of the policy.
So let's bring in the data from the July 24, 2026 report from Yale's Budget Lab. This modeling is incredibly detailed. Yale estimates that the average statutory U.S. tariff rate is currently at 11.1%. Furthermore, they project that this policy will raise the overall consumer price level by about 0.7%.
Okay, so what does that mean practically?
Well, what does that mean in real, tangible dollars? They estimate it will cost the average American household roughly $1,100 annually.
If we tie this back to the mechanical realities of household budgets we discussed earlier, an unexpected $1,100 expense is absolutely not trivial.
Not at all.
Remember our discussion about the bridge's structural capacity. For a family living paycheck to paycheck with zero margin, an unexpected $1,100 drain over the course of a year is enough to push them straight into compounding credit card debt.
But I want to explore how that $1,100 actually materializes because it's not transparent. It's not like the government mails you a literal invoice for $1,100 that says, tariff tax, please pay now.
No, it's completely baked in.
It is entirely hidden in the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
How does an 11.1% statutory rate at a port turn into an $1,100 cost for a family in Ohio?
Let's trace the mechanics of a tariffed good from the port to the living room. Tariffs are ultimately taxes on imported goods collected by customs authorities. Let's say a shipping container full of washing machines arrives at the port.
Okay, the washing machines land.
The foreign manufacturer doesn't pay the tariff. The domestic importer pays it at the border. If the washing machine costs $500 to import and the tariff is 10%, the importer pays $50 to the government. The machine now costs them $550.
But they don't just eat that $50 loss.
Of course not. They pass that cost onto the regional distributor. But the distributor marks up their prices based on a percentage of their cost. So the distributor marks up the $550, passing it to the retailer.
The compounding starts.
Right. The retailer, like a big box appliance store, also marks up their prices based on a percentage of their cost to cover their overhead and profit margin. By the time that washing machine reaches the showroom floor, that initial $50 tax at the border might have compounded into a $75 or $80 increase on the final price tag.
Wow.
The tax compounds as it moves through the supply chain. You, the consumer, paid at a cash register without ever seeing a line item for it.
The psychological impact of this looming data is profound. Even before a specific new tariff goes into effect, the sheer uncertainty alters the market. If you are a consumer and you don't know whether the price of an imported car, a refrigerator, a laptop, or lumber for your home renovation is going to spike by 10 or 15% next month, you do not wait to find out.
You adjust your behavior today. If I believe washing machines are going to be significantly more expensive in 3 months, I might rush out and put one on my credit card right now, even if my current washing machine is still technically working, but just making a weird noise.
We're trying to beat the price hike.
Exactly. I am pulling future consumption forward out of fear.
Or, conversely, a business might completely freeze its expansion plans. If a construction company cannot accurately project the cost of imported steel, machinery, or specialized components over the next year, they don't build the new warehouse.
They hold off entirely.
They don't hire the 5 new workers. Households and businesses begin making financial decisions based not only on today's prices, but tomorrow's worst-case scenarios. This creates a deeply defensive, highly fragile economic posture. When uncertainty is high, sentiment deteriorates rapidly, regardless of what the GDP printed last quarter.
So we arrive at the ultimate question. If gross domestic product doesn't capture the reality of the kitchen table, if the headline disinflation rate doesn't capture the pain at the grocery store, if the unemployment numbers don't capture the anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck, what metric actually matters?
That's the million-dollar question.
If these traditional macroeconomic yardsticks are failing to measure the real American experience, how should we as individuals be measuring our financial health?
We have to completely redefine the economic yardstick. We need to move away from measuring aggregate national output and start measuring individual resilience. And based on everything we've analyzed today, the true metric of financial well-being, the one that actually dictates how you sleep at night, is simply this: margin.
Margin. It is not about the nominal dollars you earn. It is not about your contribution to economic output. It is purely about financial breathing room.
Literally just the gap.
Yes, margin is the physical size of the gap between your net income and your absolute baseline fixed commitments. It is the depth of your emergency fund. It is the stability and predictability of your cash flow.
It's the bridge metaphor again.
Exactly. It is the answer to the ultimate question. If the bridge takes an unexpected load this month, do I have the structural tolerance to survive it without collapsing into high-interest debt?
That makes perfect sense. It completely resolves the paradox we started this deep dive with. When we look at that Federal Reserve survey, and one person says, the economy is doing fine, I'm living comfortably, and another person in the exact same city, maybe even earning the exact same salary, says, I have never felt more squeezed, this economy is a disaster, Neither of them is lying.
They are not delusional.
They are not living in alternate realities. They are just standing in different parts of the exact same economy, looking at entirely different structural architectures.
The person doing fine has margin. The person getting squeezed has none. They are experiencing the exact same macroeconomic conditions. The same 1.5% GDP growth, the same central bank interest rates, the same CPI numbers.
But the impact is totally different.
The impacts of those conditions is mediated entirely by their personal financial margin. For the person with margin, 2026 is just another year of navigating mild annoyances. For the person without margin, 2026 is a daily, grinding financial crisis.
And until policymakers, politicians, and traditional economists understand that critical distinction, they will keep arguing over the wrong metrics.
They will keep debating whether America as an aggregate is rich or poor, while millions of Americans are just trying to figure out how to absorb a 26% spike in gasoline.
This has been such a massive perspective shift. We've gone from looking at GDP and CPI all the way down to the neuroeconomics of why a $150 grocery bill turning into $185 feels like a physical penalty.
It really does.
We've explored how fixed commitments drain a paycheck before it even hits the bank account, and how the shadow of future uncertainty, like a projected $1,100 compounded cost from tariffs, changes consumer behavior right now, today. It is incredible how bright the macro numbers can look while the micro reality remains an absolute grind.
The economy you hear about on the news is measured in trillions of dollars, aggregates, and quarterly corporate reports. But the economy you actually live in is measured by the amount of cash left over after the mandatory tolls of life are paid.
Which brings us to the final thought we want to leave you with today. We've thrown a lot of numbers, a lot of historical context, and a lot of mechanical analysis at you. We've talked about money, debt, and structural capacity. But there is a hidden cost to living without margin that we haven't touched on yet, and it might be the most devastating consequence of all. Time inequality.
Time inequality.
When you lack financial margin, you don't just lose purchasing power. You are forced to spend exponentially more of your time managing your lack of resources. You spend hours on the phone negotiating with utility companies or creditors.
Waiting on hold for hours.
Exactly. You spend your weekends trying to DIY a car repair you can't afford a mechanic for, or driving across town to 3 different grocery stores just to chase sales. You might have to take on a second gig economy job, trading your evenings for extra cash just to cover the inflation gap.
It's exhausting.
Poverty, or even just the squeeze of zero margin, doesn't just drain your bank account. It strips you of the ultimate non-renewable resource, your time. So as you look at your own household ledger in this wild 2026 economy, the real question isn't whether America is rich or poor. The question is, what is your lack of margin actually costing you in hours, in stress, and in the freedom to live your life?